Most people aren't stuck because they lack discipline or motivation or intelligence. They're stuck because they are unknowingly applying the brakes while still pressing the gas. My dad used to do that, and I used to get sick in the back seat. But anyway, they read the books, they listen to the podcasts, and they want change. But movement never comes. And it's so frustrating because on the surface, it feels like effort should be enough. Here's the truth that most people miss. Growth isn't blocked by a lack of knowledge. It's blocked by self-interference, internal resistance, old identity patterns, fear disguised as logic. In the last episode, we talked about adaptability, about remembering the part of yourself that knows how to shift when the moment demands it. This episode is what happens right before the shift. And here's the part that might challenge you. What if the very thing you've been using to try to grow is the reason you're exhausted, stuck, and frustrated? Because effort, when it's misaligned, doesn't move you forward. It holds you in place. Let's talk about why trying harder might be the problem. Are you ready? I am. I'm Jonah. I'm your person. Let's get to it. Welcome back to the show. Here in part one, we're going to talk about the illusion of trying harder. Most people don't realize how deeply they've been conditioned to believe that growth is earned through pressure. If something isn't working, the answer we're taught is simple. Push harder, do more, be stricter with yourself. But that belief quietly breaks people because effort, when it's disconnected from alignment, doesn't create momentum. It creates friction. This is why so many driven, capable people feel exhausted instead of fulfilled. They're not failing because they lack discipline. They're failing because they are applying a force to a system that's already overloaded. Hustle culture didn't invent this. It's just amplified by it. The idea that constant striving is noble, that rest is weakness, that pausing means falling behind. But growth doesn't work that way. Nothing in nature evolves by forcing itself forward without rest, rhythm, or direction. A river doesn't try harder to reach the ocean. It removes obstruction and allows flow. And here's another thing. Higher level thinking asks a different question. Is the system clear? Not how hard are you pushing? So when your mind is crowded with fear, comparison, and self-judgment, more effort doesn't help. It actually strengthens the very resistance you're trying to escape. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the reason you're stuck isn't because you haven't done enough. It's because you're doing too much in the wrong direction. Trying harder becomes a way to avoid listening to your body, listening to your intuition, and listening to quiet signals that say, this isn't aligned anymore. In episode 36, we talked about the internal tug of war, you against you. This is what the struggle looks like in real time. Effort fighting insight. And effort almost always wins. Until exhaustion forces the conversation. Growth isn't about collapsing under the weight. It's about releasing what was never meant to be carried. So before you reach for more discipline, more strategy, or more pressure, just pause and ask yourself this. What would happen if progress didn't require force? Because the most powerful shifts don't happen when you push harder. They happen when you finally stop getting in your own way. All right, let's talk about self-induced stuckness here in part two. Most people believe they're stuck because of circumstances, time, money, other people, past decisions. But if we're being honest, and I mean deeply honest, the thing holding us in place is rarely external. It's internal, and it's familiar. Self-induced stuckness doesn't look dramatic. It looks responsible, logical, and even mature. It sounds like, I just need more clarity. Or, now isn't the right time. Or, once things settle down, then I'll move. But clarity rarely precedes movement. Movement creates clarity. Overthinking sometimes becomes a substitute for action. Preparation becomes a hiding place. And waiting for permission becomes a way to avoid ownership. And fear, real fear, is rarely labeled as fear. It dresses itself up as strategy, as realism, as patience. The mind is brilliant at protecting comfort, even when comfort is costing you growth. This is why the cage feels invisible. You're not trapped by force. You're held by familiarity. The routines you've outgrown, the identity you've already mastered, the version of yourself that knows how to survive, but not how to expand. None of this makes you weak. It makes you human. But higher level thinking requires something most people avoid: seeing how they participate in their own limitation. Not with judgment, with awareness. Because the moment you can see the pattern, you stop being owned by it. Stuckness isn't a life sentence. It's a signal. A signal that the version of you that got you here is no longer the version meant to take you forward. And the discomfort you feel, that's not failure. That's friction between who you've been and who you're becoming. Now here's your first challenge. Interrupt the pattern. Don't overthink this. Ask yourself, honestly, where am I delaying a decision I already know the answer to? What am I calling logic that might actually be fear? What would one small, uncomfortable movement look like this week? No grand gestures, no announcements, just one action that breaks the pattern. Because the moment you move, even slightly, baby steps, the cage starts to open. All right, let's talk about identity friction here in part 3. There's a moment in growth that doesn't get talked about enough. It's the moment when improvement doesn't feel exciting. It feels disorienting. Not because you're failing, but because the identity that carried you this far is no longer enough. In the last episode, we talked about adaptability, about the forgotten ability humans have to shift when the environment changes. That wasn't about becoming someone else. It was about remembering that you were never meant to stay fixed. This is where identity friction appears. Identity friction happens when the version of you that knows how to survive comes into conflict with the version of you that's trying to expand. The old self is familiar, predictable, and safe. It knows the rules. It knows how to be accepted. And it knows how to avoid risk. The emerging self, on the other hand, doesn't have that certainty yet. It asks for courage before comfort, movement before validation. And that creates tension. Growth often feels like betrayal, not of others, but who you've been. You start questioning yourself, second guessing your instincts, wondering if you're being reckless, unrealistic, or selfish. But this tension isn't a warning sign. It's a rite of passage. Every meaningful expansion requires the loosening of identity, a willingness to let old labels fall away before new ones are fully formed. This is why so many people retreat at this stage. Not because they can't grow, but because they don't want to disappoint the version of themselves that once kept them safe. So, adaptability, what we explored last time, isn't about shape-shifting to please the world. It's about releasing the shape you no longer need. And there's the truth most people avoid. You can't step into a higher level way of thinking whilst clinging to an identity built for a smaller world. Identity friction doesn't mean you're lost. It means you're between worlds. And that space, uncomfortable, uncertain, and quiet, is exactly where the transformation begins. All right, let's talk about the gateway to higher level thinking, which is one of my favorite parts here in part 4. Higher level thinking isn't about being smarter, and it isn't about being above anyone else. It's about perspective, without fear. Most people assume they can access higher insight simply by learning more information, more frameworks, more strategies. But higher level thinking doesn't emerge with accumulation. It emerges with clarity. And clarity can't exist in a system with noise. And noise looks like constant mental chatter, old narratives replaying, defensiveness, ego protection disguised as confidence. When the mind is busy protecting identity, it can't perceive truth. This is why so many people feel like they're missing something. Not because the insight isn't available, but because they're blocking the signal with resistance. Higher level thinking requires space to observe without immediately reacting, space to question assumptions instead of defending them, and space to hear what's been quietly trying to surface. The irony is this: the signal you're looking for is already present. Your future self is already transmitting. Your intuition has already spoken. Cause and effect are already in motion. But when fear runs the system, perspective collapses. Everything becomes urgent, personal, and threatening. And that's where growth stalls. This episode, Get Out of Your Own Way, is the prerequisite because higher level thinking can't be forced. It has to be allowed. You don't think your way into it. You clear your way into it. And as we move forward in this series into frequency, cause and effect, future self-alignment, and the experience of navigating two worlds at once, this is the doorway. Not doing more, not becoming superior, but removing what no longer serves that level you're stepping into. The moment resistance drops, perception expands. And suddenly, what felt distant feels obvious. From time to time, I like to put a recap at the end of certain parts that might come across as complex or maybe even confusing. So I want to make sure that when you leave this part, you feel good about what you heard. So let's bring this back down to real life. Higher level thinking isn't about being smarter or even having everything figured out. It's about seeing clearly without fear running the show. And most of us aren't blocked because we don't know enough. We're blocked because our minds are loud, defensive, and constantly trying to protect who we think we are. When you're always explaining yourself or always justifying or always reacting, there's no space to actually hear what's true. This episode is the doorway because nothing higher can come through a crowded system. You don't access better thinking by forcing answers. You access it by removing the noise. So when you stop protecting, stop resisting, and stop rushing, clarity shows up on its own. And that's the gateway. And here's your next challenge. Let's clear the signal. For the next 24 hours, try this. Notice when you feel the urge to defend, explain, or justify yourself. Pause instead of reacting. And then ask, what am I protecting right now? Don't correct it. Don't judge it. Just create space. Because higher level thinking doesn't arrive through force. It arrives through openness. You've got this. All right, and here's some bonus information. Look, if you want to get stronger in the higher level thinking method, I urge you to listen to the following episodes. Episode 5 of this season is called Higher Level Thinking. Episode 6, Cause and Effect. Episode 22, The Frequency We Forgot. And its sister episode, episode 23, The Frequency We Forgot and Found Again. That's a bonus show. Episode 25, Your Future Self is Cheering You On. Episode 26, The Matrix of Motivation, Halfway to Mastery. Episode 38, Two Worlds You Never Knew Existed. And episode 42, Shapeshifting, the superpower we forgot we had. And if you want even a better leg up, listen to all of the Messages of the Universe volumes. That'll give you great insight. All right, let's talk about messages are meant to move you here in part 5. When people hear the phrase messages from the universe, they often think it's about signs or symbols or something external trying to save them. But the real purpose of those messages is much simpler. They're meant to help you stop getting in your own way. That's why I created the Messages from the Universe volumes in the first place. Not to inspire passivity and not to replace responsibility, but to interrupt the resistance. Each message points to the same truth from a different angle. You already know more than you're allowing yourself to act on. The problem isn't that guidance is missing. It's that people hesitate when it arrives. They second guess. They wait. They explain it away. And that hesitation is self-interference. Messages don't come to comfort you. They come to nudge you out of patterns that no longer fit, out of silence, out of delay, out of identities that feel safe but small. And if you've listened to those volumes, you've probably noticed something. The messages don't tell you what to do. They remind you of what you've been avoiding. Speak the truth. Take the step. Release the attachment. Trust the timing you keep doubting. That's not coincidence. That's alignment trying to speak through resistance. But here's the key. A message that isn't honored becomes noise. You can consume insight endlessly and never move. You can feel seen and still stay stuck. Because awareness without action doesn't free you. It just makes you more aware of the cage. Look, messages only work when they're met with movement. And movement doesn't have to be dramatic. It just has to be honest. This is where getting out of your own way becomes practical. Not by searching for more signs, but by responding to the ones you've already received. All right, we're on fire now. Let's talk about removing that gosh darn resistance once and for all here in part 6. By now, one thing should be clear. Getting out of your own way isn't about becoming more disciplined, more motivated, or even more impressive. It's about removing resistance. Here's the thing. Resistance shows up quietly, not as refusal, but hesitation. Not as fear, but as delay. You feel it when you know what to do, but keep waiting for the right moment. You feel it when you keep refining a plan instead of taking the first step. You feel it when you protect a version of yourself that already feels familiar, even though it no longer feels true. This is why growth feels heavy. You're carrying things you don't need anymore. Old narratives, outdated identities, explanations that once kept you safe. Higher level thinking doesn't ask you to add more to your life. It actually asks you to subtract. Less noise, less overthinking, less self-negotiation. When resistance drops, action becomes obvious, not dramatic and not fearless, just more clear. And here's the thing. You don't suddenly feel ready. You feel honest. Honest about what you've been avoiding. Honest about what you've been delaying. And honest about the version of yourself you're still protecting. And here's the part most people miss. You don't remove resistance by fighting it. You remove it by seeing it. The moment you notice, I'm stalling here, you regain choice. And choice is where movement begins. This is why getting out of your own way doesn't feel explosive. It feels quiet, like relief, or like exhale. Like finally putting something down. Look, you don't need to become someone new. You need to stop resisting who you already are. All right, and here's your third and final challenge for this episode. Subtract one thing. Now let's keep this simple. Ask yourself, where am I hesitating even though I already know the next step? What am I overthinking that actually needs action? What can I remove, not add, this week? Then do one of the following. Say the thing you've been holding back. Take the step you've been postponing. And stop waiting for reassurance. No announcements, no perfection, just movement. Because the moment resistance is removed, forward motion takes over. All right, let's talk about your future self-alignment here in part 7. Here's the quiet truth most people don't realize. Your future self isn't waiting on you. They're already living the decision you're hesitating to make. Not because it was easy, but because at some point, resistance stopped being louder than truth. Every version of you that has ever grown did so the same way, by choosing movement before certainty. That's how cause and effect works. What feels brave today becomes normal tomorrow. What feels uncomfortable now becomes your baseline later. This is why getting out of your own way isn't about pushing into the future. It's about aligning with what's already trying to emerge. Earlier in this episode, we talked about effort versus alignment, about self-induced stuckness, about identity friction. Here's the through line. You were never blocked by a lack of potential. You were blocked by resistance. Resistance to change, resistance to discomfort, and resistance to releasing identities that once made sense. The moment resistance drops, the future stops feeling distant. Fear doesn't disappear, but it changes meaning. Fear becomes a signal that you're close, not wrong. Close to the conversation you've been avoiding, close to the step you've been postponing, and close to the version of yourself that doesn't need permission anymore. This is what alignment actually feels like. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady. You don't suddenly know every answer. You just stop arguing with the one you already have. And that's where higher level thinking becomes lived experience. Not something you learn, but something you practice. Your future self isn't asking you to become perfect. They're asking you to move. And once you do, today's courage becomes tomorrow's normal. As we close the show, I'd like to leave you with this final message. What you're becoming doesn't need more effort. It needs less resistance. You were never meant to force your way forward, only to release what's been holding you in place. And throughout this episode, one thing has stayed consistent. Clarity doesn't come from doing more. It comes from getting out of your own way. The signals are already there, and the next step is already known. You don't need permission. You don't need certainty. And you don't need to wait. You just need movement. As we continue through higher level thinking, we'll explore frequency, cause and effect, and future self-alignment, not as concepts, but as lived experiences. For now, trust this. When resistance drops, life responds. And the moment you move, even quietly, with baby steps, the path meets you halfway. Stay grounded. Stay open. And the rest will reveal itself. Thanks so much again for continuing to go on this journey with me. Please don't forget to subscribe to the show and turn on your notifications so you never miss an episode. It really does help the show grow, and I'm trying to expand the reach of the show, so anything you can do to help out is greatly appreciated. Join me next week for a new episode of Challenge Accepted with Jonah C. Until then, thanks for joining, thanks for listening, and have a great new year. Conquer 2026.